They pushed the poor black patient to the bottom of the surgery list and told the black nurse to stay in her lane. She disobeyed, helped a gifted surgeon save his life, and was dragged before the hospital board in shame. But when the patient woke up and called her Miss Whitmore, every face in that room changed. The woman they treated like she didn't belong was the black heiress to the entire hospital empire, and the only one brave enough to expose the racism buried inside its walls. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. A cold Boston rain swept across the glass towers of the city that morning, turning the streets around Whitmore Medical Center into ribbons of silver and blurred headlights. The harbor wind carried the sharp scent of salt and spring rain, while the hospital's towering steel and glass facade reflected a city waking too fast and caring too little. Inside those walls, lives were saved every hour. But power, prejudice, and old secrets often decided whose life mattered first. Charlotte Whitmore stepped through the employee entrance wearing plain blue scrubs and a white nurse's jacket with the stitched name Lottie Reed. Charlotte was a 29-year-old black woman, tall and elegantly athletic, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow even beneath the sterile hospital lights. Her natural shoulder-length curls framed a defined oval face, sharp cheekbones, and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. She carried herself with quiet authority, the kind born not from privilege but from surviving rooms where people constantly underestimated her. Years earlier, when her father died in what the world called a car accident, Charlotte had watched the hospital board slowly erase his vision of equal care. That loss had hardened her discipline and sharpened her sense of justice. Behind her calm posture lived a woman who had learned to hide power beneath patience. Today, she had returned to the empire that bore her family name, not as the black heiress the board feared, but as a nurse no one would notice. Or so she thought. As soon as she reached the ICU floor, a voice cut through the hum of monitors and rolling carts. Well, look at that. A young doctor in a pressed white coat leaned against the nurse station, his lips curling into a smirk as his eyes moved from Charlotte's face to the badge clipped to her jacket. Dr. Trevor Mills was 32, tall and narrow-shouldered with pale skin, sandy blonde hair combed too perfectly, and cold gray eyes sharpened by entitlement. He had the polished look of a man who had never been told no for long. Born into a wealthy Connecticut medical family, Trevor wore arrogance as naturally as his stethoscope. Years of being praised for pedigree over compassion had shaped him into someone who mistook privilege for excellence. He tapped her badge with one finger. "Lottie Reed," he said, chuckling. "You sure you're on the right floor? ICU isn't exactly where we place people hired just to meet diversity quotas." A few nurses nearby stiffened. One resident gave an awkward laugh. Another looked down and pretended not to hear. Charlotte felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her chest, the old poison she had swallowed in Harvard lecture halls, boardrooms, and charity galas where men twice her age had asked whose assistant she was. But before she could answer, another voice stepped in. "Funny," the man said evenly, "because from where I'm standing, the only person out of place is the one wasting time judging staff instead of helping patients." The speaker stepped out from a patient room, removing surgical gloves. Dr. Ethan Brooks was 34, broad-shouldered and calm, with deep brown skin, a strong jawline softened by tired kindness, and steady dark eyes that seemed to weigh people by their actions rather than their titles. His black hair was cropped close, and faint exhaustion shadowed his face after a double overnight shift. Ethan came from Roxbury, one of Boston's tougher neighborhoods, and had fought through scholarship programs, night jobs, and the death of his mother from delayed hospital treatment to become one of Whitmore's most gifted trauma surgeons. That loss had made him fiercely protective of patients society ignored. Trevor scoffed. "Stay out of it, Brooks." Ethan walked past him and handed Charlotte a chart. "A person who can save a life always belongs in the ICU," he said, meeting her eyes, "more than someone who only knows how to judge." For a second, the hallway fell silent. Trevor muttered something under his breath and stormed away. Charlotte looked at Ethan, surprised by the calm certainty in him. "Thank you," she said quietly. He shrugged, but there was warmth in the corner of his mouth. "People tell on themselves fast in hospitals," Ethan replied, "usually before breakfast." Before Charlotte could respond, an alarm blared from the ER intake corridor. A homeless patient had collapsed. The gurney burst through the double doors surrounded by rushed voices. The man looked to be in his late 60s, thin beneath layers of worn coats, rainwater dripping from a gray beard onto the sheets. His hands were rough and scarred, his face weathered by years of sleeping under bridges and city shelters. Mr. Samuel Carter, 68, was known to some ER nurses as a quiet, homeless veteran who occasionally wandered near the hospital for warmth. His once powerful frame had been reduced by time and neglect, but his sharp hazel eyes still carried the awareness of someone who remembered far more than people assumed. Years ago, Samuel had worked as a private driver for powerful families in Boston, and tragedy had left him distrustful, solitary, and deeply haunted. Trevor glanced at the chart and frowned. "No insurance, no ID, put him in observation." Ethan's eyes hardened. "He's crashing. He's homeless," Trevor snapped back. "The donor surgery upstairs takes priority." Charlotte saw it immediately, the pattern she had feared. A wealthy donor had arrived for a scheduled cardiac procedure. A black homeless man was being pushed to the bottom of the list, not because of medicine, because of money, because of status, because some lives were easier for this institution to ignore. Ethan moved first. "Get him into Bay 3? Trevor stepped forward. "You'll answer to the board for this." Ethan didn't even turn around. Then they can hear how close they came to letting him die. Charlotte followed Ethan into the trauma bay, assisting him as monitors were attached and oxygen started. Their hands moved in perfect rhythm. He called for fluids. She anticipated them. He requested medication. She already had it ready. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt something unexpected inside the empire she had come to investigate. Hope. The procedure stabilized Samuel enough for him to breathe. As the room quieted, the old man's fingers twitched. His eyes fluttered open. Then they landed on Charlotte. For one long second, confusion crossed his face. Then recognition. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Samuel reached beneath the collar of his coat and pulled free a chain. At the end of it hung a silver watch. Charlotte froze. It was unmistakable. A Whitmore heirloom pocket watch, engraved with the initials of her father, Edward Whitmore. The very watch that had disappeared the night he died 20 years ago. Her breath caught. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. Samuel's voice came out weak and broken. "He gave it to me. The night everything changed." Ethan looked between them, stunned. Charlotte stepped closer, her pulse pounding. "That watch belonged to my father." Samuel studied her face, and something in his expression softened. "You've got his eyes," he murmured. Outside the room, Charlotte heard footsteps and hushed voices. Two senior hospital administrators stood near the glass wall, unaware she could hear them. One of them, Monica Hayes, a sharply dressed operations manager in her 40s with clipped blonde hair and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, spoke in a low voice. "If the board ever lets a woman like her take control, Whitmore Medical will collapse." The other man nodded. "Especially a black heiress trying to turn this place into a social justice project." Charlotte's jaw tightened. So it was true. Even before officially returning, they had already decided what kind of leader she was allowed to be. Ethan noticed the shift in her face. "You okay?" Charlotte forced calm back into her voice. "I'm fine." But Samuel lifted a weak hand toward her. "No," he rasped. "You need to know the truth." The room seemed to shrink around his words. Rain tapped harder against the hospital windows. The monitors beeped in steady rhythm. Ethan stood still beside her, sensing this moment mattered far beyond medicine. Samuel swallowed painfully. "Your father wanted to change this hospital," he whispered. He wanted equal care for black families, for poor families, for everyone they pushed aside. Charlotte felt tears sting behind her eyes. That had always been the rumor. A dream erased after his death. Samuel's hand trembled around the watch. He didn't die because of the storm that night. Charlotte leaned closer. The world seemed to narrow into the old man's cracked voice. He died because someone in this family betrayed him. Silence. Not shock, not grief, something colder. The feeling of an old wound reopening. Charlotte stared at the watch in his palm. The same silver glint she remembered from childhood dinners. From the night her father kissed her forehead and promised hospitals should heal everyone. Outside the room, thunder rolled over Boston Harbor. Inside, Charlotte Whitmore understood one terrifying truth. Her first day back had not uncovered workplace prejudice. It had uncovered the beginning of a murder buried inside her own family empire. And somewhere above them in the boardroom that still doubted a black woman could lead, the people responsible were still watching. The storm over Boston had not fully passed by the next morning. Gray clouds still pressed low against the skyline, and the harbor wind rattled the upper windows of Whitmore Medical as if the city itself were warning Charlotte Whitmore that what she had uncovered in Samuel Carter's room was only the surface. She entered through the same employee corridor in plain blue scrubs, the name Lottie Reed still clipped to her chest. But today the hospital no longer felt like a place she was observing from the outside. It felt personal. Her father's missing watch now rested in the pocket of her jacket, its cold silver weight pressing against her ribs like a heartbeat from the past. Charlotte moved through the surgical coordination floor with sharper eyes than before. Overnight, she had barely slept. Samuel's words repeated in her mind. Someone in this family betrayed him. But as devastating as that truth was, another pattern was beginning to form around her, one she could see in the frightened eyes of patients and the quiet tension among overworked nurses. She stopped at the digital surgery board mounted outside the pre-op unit. Names, times, priorities. A wealthy white donor scheduled for a non-urgent vascular correction had been moved ahead of 3 emergency cases. One of them was a black woman in her 50s with worsening internal bleeding. Another was a teenage black boy whose ruptured appendix had already been delayed once. A third was an elderly Latino janitor with signs of bowel ischemia. All 3 had been pushed beneath lower-risk premium patients. Charlotte's jaw tightened. This was not a mistake. This was policy hidden behind resource optimization. A quiet voice beside her broke her concentration. You saw it too. She turned. Dr. Ethan Brooks stood there in dark navy surgical scrubs, coffee untouched in his hand. The exhaustion in his face was heavier this morning, but so was the determination in his eyes. Ethan had spent the night reviewing patient outcomes after what happened with Samuel, unable to ignore the pattern Charlotte had also begun to notice. Years ago, when his mother died, waiting 12 extra hours for treatment because another insured patient was prioritized, Ethan had promised himself he would never stop watching the numbers behind the human suffering. This list is manipulated, Charlotte said quietly. Ethan nodded once. It's been happening for years. They call it donor preservation and institutional sustainability. Charlotte looked at the names again. No, it's racial and economic triage. The words sat between them with brutal honesty. Before Ethan could answer, a transport nurse rushed down the corridor. The woman pushing the gurney was Nurse Elena Ruiz, a compact woman in her late 30s with warm brown skin, dark hair tied into a practical bun, and tired but compassionate eyes. Elena had worked double shifts for years to support 2 children after losing her husband in a construction accident, and the grief had turned her into the kind of nurse who protected vulnerable patients like family. Dr. Brooks, Elena said breathlessly, Room 14's pressure is dropping again. They still haven't cleared him for surgery. Ethan glanced at the board. Room 14. The elderly Latino janitor. Still waiting. Charlotte stepped beside him. Who moved him? Elena hesitated, then lowered her voice. Administrative override from surgical planning. That was all Charlotte needed to hear. For the next hour, she and Ethan quietly worked inside the coordination software terminal in an unused staff office. The room was small, lit by fluorescent bulbs that buzzed softly overhead, but inside that stale silence, something radical was happening. Charlotte used her administrative training and hidden executive access knowledge to locate the logic tree controlling surgery priority scores. Insurance tier, donor relation, projected hospital value, VIP waiting. Ethan stared at the formulas in disbelief. They built class and race into the system without ever writing those words. Charlotte's fingers moved over the keyboard. Then we rewrite the language. Together, they began secretly altering the emergency triage matrix, not enough to trigger an audit, but enough to force higher-risk cases back where they medically belonged. The black woman with internal bleeding moved up. The teenage boy moved to immediate prep. The janitor's case was elevated to urgent intervention. For the first time in years, the list resembled medicine instead of politics. Ethan looked at Charlotte with something deeper than admiration. "You knew how to find that fast." She met his gaze and allowed herself the smallest smile. "I've spent my whole life learning how systems hide discrimination behind professional words." Before either of them could say more, the office door opened sharply. A woman stepped in without knocking. Dr. Vanessa Cole was 33. Statuesque and immaculately composed, with fair skin, sleek auburn hair pulled into a polished low knot, and sharp green eyes that always seemed one step ahead of everyone else. As senior surgical operations strategist, Vanessa had built her reputation on efficiency, elite networking, and absolute loyalty to hospital donors. Raised in an old-money Beacon Hill family that measured people by pedigree, Vanessa viewed compassion as weakness unless it improved public relations. Years ago, losing a promotion to a socially connected colleague had hardened her belief that only ruthless control kept ambitious women safe. Her gaze dropped to the altered board on the screen. For one moment, the room chilled. Then her lips curved into a smile too thin to be kind. "So it's you," Vanessa said, looking directly at Charlotte. "I was wondering who suddenly decided Whitmore should become a social project for the working-class districts." Her eyes flicked toward Ethan. "And you're helping her." Ethan stepped forward. "We're correcting patient risk order." Vanessa laughed softly. "No, Ethan. You're destabilizing a system designed to protect this hospital's future." Charlotte stood. "What future exactly? One where poor black patients die in hallways so wealthy donors never wait." Vanessa's expression sharpened. "You always want to turn places like this into some moral crusade. Do you have any idea what keeps these buildings standing?" "It's not sentiment. It's money." The words were directed at Charlotte, but the undertone was sharper. A black woman challenging a system she was never meant to inherit. A woman from privilege who still wasn't considered the right kind. Charlotte held her gaze. And yet, somehow, the people with the least money are the ones paying the highest price. For the first time, Vanessa's composure cracked just enough to reveal irritation. "This hospital isn't a charity for Roxbury." Ethan's shoulders stiffened. Neither missed the coded insult. Class, race, neighborhood. Vanessa turned toward the door, then paused. "Be careful what battles you pick, Lottie. Systems have a way of crushing people who forget where they belong." When she left, the silence she left behind felt heavier than before. Ethan exhaled slowly. She's going to watch every move now. Charlotte looked back at the board. "Let her." By afternoon, the effects of the hidden changes were already visible. The teenage boy was rushed into surgery in time. The black woman's bleeding was controlled before sepsis could spread. The janitor was finally prepped. But what struck Charlotte hardest wasn't the data. It was the families. A black mother in the waiting room cried when she heard her son had been moved into surgery. An elderly wife clasped Elena's hands and whispered prayers in Spanish. For the first time that day, Charlotte felt something her father must have felt when he first dreamed of equal care. Purpose. Later, during a brief break in the hospital cafe, Ethan found Charlotte staring through the rain-streaked windows toward the city. "You're carrying more than just today, aren't you?" She hesitated, fingers brushing the pocket where the watch rested. Yes. Ethan waited. That patience in him, the refusal to force trust, made her answer. I think my father died because he tried to stop this. Ethan's expression darkened, not with shock, but recognition. Then what we changed today wasn't just about the patients. Charlotte shook her head. No, it was proof his fight was real. Across the room, Vanessa stood partially hidden near the glass hallway, speaking quietly into her phone. Charlotte couldn't hear every word. Only fragments. Yes, she's changing the list. If the board finds out. Whitmore blood always causes trouble. Then Vanessa turned and walked away before Charlotte could follow. By evening, Boston's rain had softened into mist, and the surgery board glowed quietly in the dim corridor light. For now, the right patients had been saved. For now, the system had bent. But Charlotte knew people like Vanessa did not protect policies without protecting the secrets behind them. And somewhere in the machinery of Whitmore Medical, the same invisible hands that had once buried her father's vision were beginning to notice someone was rewriting his war. By the third morning, Boston had traded rain for a brittle silver sunlight that bounced off the Charles River and turned Whitmore Medical's glass exterior into a mirror of cold ambition. Inside, however, the air felt heavier than ever. Charlotte Whitmore walked through the executive elevator lobby still dressed as Lottie Reed. But today the disguise felt thinner. After quietly rewriting the surgical priority system with Ethan, she had forced the hospital to reveal something dangerous. Someone had built racial and class bias into the very structure of care. And now, as she was summoned to the upper administrative floors, she knew the institution was preparing its response. The executive boardroom occupied the top floor, overlooking Boston Harbor like a throne room above the suffering below. Charlotte entered through a side service corridor and paused outside the half-open oak doors. Voices drifted out, measured, controlled, wealthy. The kind of voices that made decisions about life without ever hearing a patient cry. At the head of the room sat Eleanor Whitmore, Charlotte's grandmother and the formidable matriarch of Whitmore Medical. Eleanor was a 76-year-old black woman with deep mahogany skin softened by age but not by weakness. Her silver hair was styled into elegant waves pinned low at the nape, and her posture remained regal despite the cane resting beside her chair. She had spent decades surviving rooms dominated by white men who smiled in public and conspired in private, and those years had made her dangerously observant. Though she loved Charlotte fiercely, Eleanor had also learned that family empires were protected through compromises that sometimes wounded the people they were meant to elevate. Across from her sat several board members, among them Richard Halston, a pale, broad-faced man in his 60s whose tailored navy suit fit like inherited power. Richard came from an old Massachusetts banking family and had spent 40 years on corporate healthcare boards. His manner was polished, but his worldview remained fixed in old hierarchies: wealth, lineage, image. To him, trust was something the public extended more easily to familiar white faces. Charlotte remained just outside the doorway as Richard's voice carried across the room. "If Charlotte is truly going to take the chair next quarter," he said, fingers steepled over the conference table, "then optics matter." Another member murmured in agreement. Richard continued, "The public will trust a leadership couple with a more traditional image." Charlotte's stomach tightened. Traditional. The word was clean. Professional, respectable, and poisoned. A woman on the far side of the table added, "We're not questioning her intelligence, but perception shapes confidence. Investors, donors, the city press, they respond to familiarity." Eleanor's silence told Charlotte everything. This was not about shares alone. It was about race coded into branding. About a black woman being told, yet again, that excellence alone would never be enough. Richard slid a folder across the polished wood. The Halcyon pharmaceutical merger can secure long-term research funding, but only if the engagement proceeds. Charlotte knew the name: Andrew Sinclair, heir to Halcyon Pharmaceuticals. The white son of Boston's most politically connected pharmaceutical dynasty. a marriage alliance disguised as strategic stability, and standing beside Charlotte on the hospital stage, he would become exactly what the board wanted. A white male face to soften the discomfort of her becoming CEO. The meeting ended before she was noticed. Charlotte stepped away from the door, her pulse steady but cold. So this was their answer, not whether she was capable. Whether she looked acceptable? Later that afternoon, Charlotte sat alone in an unused consultation office when Ethan found her. He knocked once before entering, his expression shifting the moment he saw her face. "You look like someone just put a scalpel through your patience." Despite herself, Charlotte let out a dry breath of laughter. "They want me married." Ethan leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "That sounds less like a family request and more like a board strategy." "It is." She looked up at him, the exhaustion finally breaking through her composure. "They want a traditional image beside me when I take the chair." Ethan's jaw tightened. There it was again. The hospital's polished way of saying a black woman needed whitening at the edges to be publicly trusted. He spoke carefully. "And the groom?" "Andrew Sinclair." Ethan gave a humorless smile. "Of course." Before the conversation could go further, Charlotte's pager vibrated. It was a quiet, coded message from Ethan's younger sister. Mia Brooks had been working nights in Whitmore's clinical research archive under a fellowship program. At 26, Mia was slim and sharp-eyed, with warm, brown skin like Ethan's and tightly braided hair usually pulled beneath a lab cap. Unlike her brother's calm steadiness, Mia possessed restless investigative energy. Their mother's death from delayed treatment had driven Ethan toward surgery, but it had driven Mia toward research ethics, determined to expose the systems that decided whose lives were worth risking in clinical trials. Charlotte and Ethan found her in the lower records lab, a dim basement level lined with servers and locked file cabinets. Mia looked pale. "I found something," she said, glancing toward the closed door. She pulled up archived demographic data tied to an old Whitmore-licensed cardiovascular drug trial from 19 years earlier. Rows of neighborhoods filled the screen. Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. Predominantly black and lower-income communities. Mia zoomed in on enrollment ratios. 92% of the subjects came from black neighborhoods, she said, but the public summary called it a citywide pilot. Charlotte stared at the numbers. It wasn't just disproportionate, it was targeted. Ethan's voice lowered. "Were outcomes tracked honestly?" Mia shook her head. "Not all of them. Some adverse events were coded as unrelated transport complications." Charlotte's fingers went still on the desk. Transport complications. The same language used in the official report of her father's accident. A chill moved through the room. Mia continued. "I'm not saying it's the same case yet, but whoever approved this research pipeline was feeding experimental medicine into black working-class communities long before the current board." The room fell silent except for the hum of the server fans. Above them, the hospital presented itself as Boston's pinnacle of modern medicine. Below, buried in basement records, the data whispered something else. Exploitation. Pattern. Legacy. Charlotte looked from the trial maps to the board's demand for a white pharmaceutical heir by her side. The pieces were not fully connected, but the shape of the machine was becoming clearer. This hospital did not simply resist change, it had been built on carefully managed appearances for decades. That evening, as sunset painted the city skyline in pale amber, Charlotte received a private invitation to dinner at the Whitmore estate. The mansion in Beacon Hill stood behind black iron gates and old elm trees, its stone walls carrying generations of ambition. At the dining table, Eleanor sat at the head in silk burgundy evening wear, her silver hair glowing softly under chandelier light. She studied Charlotte for a long moment. "You heard them?" It wasn't a question. Charlotte nodded. Eleanor sighed, the sound layered with history. "When I was your age, they told me the same thing in different words. They said the hospital could accept my mind, but not my face, so I learned to let them underestimate me while I built something they could never remove." Charlotte's anger softened into something more painful. Then why are you letting them do this to me? Eleanor's gaze lowered. Because sometimes surviving a system and changing it are not the same battle. The answer hurt precisely because it came from love. Not betrayal, fear that the board, donors, and media would punish Charlotte not for incompetence, but for being a black woman too visibly in charge. Charlotte stood from the table. I won't let them choose a husband to make white donors comfortable. For the first time that evening, Eleanor smiled faintly. Good. Charlotte paused. Her grandmother's dark eyes gleamed with something almost proud. I needed to know whether you would fight them. The words changed the room. This had not only been pressure, it had also been a test, not of obedience, of resolve. Outside the mansion, the Boston night carried the distant sound of traffic and harbor wind. Charlotte stepped onto the stone terrace, the city lights spread below like 1,000 watching eyes. In her coat pocket, her phone vibrated again. A message from Mia. More trial records missing. Someone is cleaning the archive. Charlotte looked back toward the glowing mansion windows, then toward the skyline where Whitmore Medical pierced the night. The marriage alliance, the coded racism of the board, the pharmaceutical family, and the buried trials in black neighborhoods were no longer separate battles. They were threads in the same tapestry, and somewhere inside the alliance they wanted to force on her was the face of the machine that had profited from communities like Ethan's while asking Charlotte to smile beside it. She closed her hand around the phone. Tomorrow the board would expect an answer. Tonight, she had finally decided one thing. She would never let them use her blackness as something to be hidden behind a white silhouette. The next morning, Boston woke beneath a pale blue sky washed clean by the previous days of rain. But inside Whitmore Medical, the atmosphere felt electric, brittle, and waiting for impact. Charlotte Whitmore stood in the executive changing suite on the 12th floor, staring at her reflection as she removed the badge that read, Lottie Reed. The simple nurse scrubs that had allowed her to witness the hospital's cruelty from the inside were folded neatly on the bench behind her. In their place, she now wore a tailored charcoal suit beneath a white physician's coat embroidered with the discreet silver crest of the Whitmore family. Her deep brown skin glowed against the stark white collar. Her shoulder-length natural curls framed a face sharpened by sleepless resolve, and her dark, intelligent eyes no longer carried the caution of someone hiding. They carried authority. After everything she had uncovered, the racial triage system, the buried drug trials, and the board's coded attempt to whiten her public image through marriage, Charlotte had made her decision. If the system feared her visibility, then she would stop giving it the comfort of her disguise. The revelation spread through the hospital before she even reached the surgical wing. Whispers moved faster than elevators. Nurses paused mid-chart. Residents turned in corridors. Phones lit up with internal messages. By the time Charlotte entered the main surgical conference room, every seat was filled. At the front stood Dr. Vanessa Cole, composed as ever in her ivory blouse and fitted surgical slacks, auburn hair pinned flawlessly into place. Her green eyes narrowed the moment Charlotte stepped through the doors. Vanessa had always thrived in rooms where hierarchy protected her, but this morning the hierarchy itself had shifted beneath her feet. Charlotte moved to the front podium and set a tablet on the lectern. I believe it's time we stop pretending introductions are necessary, she said calmly. Silence. Then the first murmurs. A young orthopedic surgeon in the third row rose to his feet. Dr. Caleb Mercer, 35, broad-built with sharp blue eyes and the expensive confidence of a surgeon who had inherited prestige before he had earned skill, folded his arms across his chest. Caleb came from an elite Philadelphia medical dynasty and had spent his career assuming promotions followed pedigree. Years of institutional praise had made him deeply threatened by talent he could not socially categorize. He spoke loudly enough for the entire room. So what is this exactly? Did you earn your way into this position, or did Whitmore just need a diversity figurehead? The words hit harder than Trevor's insult in the ICU. Not because they were louder, because they targeted the wound beneath everything. Harvard. Years of medical administration training. The nights she studied while grieving her father. the boardrooms where she outperformed men who still asked who she belonged to. Every achievement flattened into one accusation. Token. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the edge of the podium, but before she answered, another chair scraped sharply against the floor. Ethan stood. Dr. Ethan Brooks stepped into the aisle in navy surgical scrubs, shoulders squared, his deep brown skin and calm, unshakable presence commanding the room in a way titles never could. He looked directly at Caleb, then let his gaze sweep over the other doctors who had remained silent. "She's more qualified than anyone in this room," Ethan said, his voice low but carrying through every row. "And the reason some of you are uncomfortable has nothing to do with competence. It's because she's better than you, and you're afraid of what that says about the system that kept rewarding you." The room froze. No one breathed. No one interrupted. Ethan took another step forward. She saw the triage bias none of you questioned. She found the manipulated priority scores. She exposed the way Black and working-class patients were pushed behind donors. If that threatens your ego, that's not her problem. A nurse near the back lowered her head, fighting a smile. Even a few younger residents exchanged guilty glances. Charlotte looked at Ethan, and for a moment the sterile conference room seemed to narrow into one clear truth. He had just done in public what very few people in institutions like this ever dared. He had named the fear behind racism. Vanessa's voice cut into the silence. "This isn't a courtroom speech, Ethan." "No," he replied without looking at her. "It's overdue honesty." Charlotte stepped beside him at the front of the room. "Thank you," she said quietly, then faced the department again. "This hospital has confused polished discrimination with professionalism for too long. That ends now." The morning meeting dissolved into tense clusters of whispers and hurried exits, but the ripple had already moved through the building. By noon, the story had reached every floor. The black nurse they mocked had been Charlotte Whitmore all along. Later, in the physician's lounge, Charlotte finally allowed herself to breathe. Ethan entered carrying 2 coffees. "One black," he said, handing her the cup. Felt symbolic. She laughed softly for the first time that day. "You really didn't have to do that in there." "Yes, I did." He leaned against the counter, studying her. "I've spent my whole career watching people like Caleb pretend merit belongs to legacy and the right skin tone. Somebody had to say what they're all thinking." Charlotte's eyes dropped briefly. "When he said I was just a diversity image," Ethan's expression softened. "That hurt because it was designed to." She nodded once. The honesty between them settled deeper than either wanted to name. Before the moment could linger, Mia rushed into the lounge, breathless and pale. At 26, Mia Brooks carried the same warm brown skin and sharp dark eyes as Ethan. But where her brother radiated grounded calm, Mia moved with investigative intensity. Today, her usually neat braids were slightly loose, and her tablet was clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "They know someone's been in the old research files," she said. Charlotte straightened. "How bad?" Mia opened the tablet. 3 folders had been accessed and partially wiped overnight. Trial demographics, adverse event transport reports, executive approval signatures. The missing signatures belong to an archived authorization chain connected to Halcyon Pharmaceuticals, Andrew Sinclair's family. Charlotte's pulse slowed into that dangerous stillness that always came before clarity. "So the board's marriage proposal and the erased trial records are connected." Mia nodded grimly. "Whoever wants you tied to Halcyon also wants the old research buried." Ethan looked between them. "That means exposing yourself today forced someone's hand." Charlotte moved toward the window overlooking Boston Harbor. Afternoon sunlight flashed against the water, bright and cold, the city deceptively peaceful beneath the weight of everything happening inside Whitmore. For years, this hospital had hidden racism behind etiquette, profit behind policy, and fear behind public confidence. Now it was hiding evidence. It was hiding. That evening, Charlotte was summoned to an emergency leadership roundtable in the executive board lounge. The long mahogany table was lined with department heads, donors, and board members, all watching her with new caution. Richard Halston spoke first. "You should have informed the board before revealing yourself to the medical staff." Charlotte met his stare. "And give you more time to shape the story." A few faces shifted uncomfortably. Richard exhaled. "The issue is stability." "No," Charlotte said. "The issue is that this institution trusted me as a nurse until it learned I owned it." The room went silent again. Not because they disagreed. Because the truth had been spoken too plainly to escape. Eleanor Whitmore, seated quietly at the far end, finally lifted her chin. Pride flickered in her dark eyes, though she hid it behind practiced neutrality. When the meeting ended, Charlotte stepped alone into the glass sky bridge connecting the executive tower to the surgical wing. Below her, ambulances pulled into the ER entrance, red lights cutting through the evening shadows. Ethan appeared beside her moments later. "You okay?" Charlotte stared down at the city. They never doubted Lottie's work. They doubted Charlotte's right to exist at the top. Ethan stood beside her in silence for a moment. Then, with the calm certainty that had anchored her since the ICU, he said, "That's because they built this place, assuming someone like you would never come back to claim it." Charlotte turned to him. "And now?" Ethan's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "Now they're terrified." For the first time since revealing herself, the pain of the accusation no longer sat at the center of her chest. Something else had taken its place. Resolve, not because the hospital had accepted her, but because its fear had finally become visible. As the sun sank behind Boston's skyline, turning the glass corridors gold, Charlotte understood that exposing her identity had done more than shock the staff. It had forced Whitmore Medical to reveal exactly who felt threatened by a brilliant black woman no longer willing to hide. And that truth, painful as it was the first honest diagnosis this institution had ever faced. A sharp Atlantic wind swept across Boston that evening, turning the city lights along the harbor into trembling ribbons on the dark water. Inside Whitmore Medical, however, the tension had moved far beyond staff whispers and coded boardroom insults. Charlotte's public return as the Black Heiress had shattered the hospital's carefully managed comfort, and by sunrise the next day, the consequences arrived in a form no one in the building had expected. The executive reception floor, usually reserved for donors and trustees, had been cleared for a private inheritance review session. Charlotte stepped out of the elevator in a deep, navy-tailored suit, the silver Whitmore crest pinned neatly above her heart. Her posture was upright, her natural curls softly framing a face that had grown more controlled with each new betrayal. The days of hiding as Lottie Reed were over, but what remained was the discipline she had learned in disguise. Watch first, speak second, strike only when the truth was visible. At the far end of the marble lobby, a man stood beside the panoramic window overlooking the Boston skyline. He turned as she approached. Nathan Whitmore was 38, tall and lean with a surgeon's precise posture, warm brown skin a shade lighter than Charlotte's, and a sharply defined face marked by a quiet kind of discipline. His dark hair was close-cropped, streaked slightly at the temples, and his deep-set hazel eyes carried both intelligence and distance. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit instead of a lab coat, though everything about the way he moved suggested a life built around clinical precision. Raised in New York by his late mother after a hidden relationship with Charlotte's father, Nathan had built a national reputation as a medical research executive. Yet beneath the polished calm was a man shaped by years of exclusion, knowing he carried Whitmore blood while being denied the name publicly. That old wound had hardened into pride, and pride into judgment. For a long moment Nathan simply looked at Charlotte. Then his voice came, low and controlled. "Our father built this hospital on standards of perfection." His eyes moved over her face, measured and unreadable. "I'm not sure you understand the weight of the Whitmore name." The words landed like a blade wrapped in silk. Not loud, not openly cruel, but sharpened by the same old poison she had heard in different voices all week. Charlotte stepped closer, holding his gaze. "Are you doubting me because of the data?" she asked evenly, "or because of my skin?" The marble lobby seemed to fall silent around them. Nathan's expression shifted, just slightly. It was the first time someone had spoken the coded suspicion aloud. The verbal clash carried the energy of a courtroom cross-examination. Evidence versus assumption. Bloodline versus bias. Nathan folded his hands behind his back. I'm questioning whether sentiment is clouding your judgment. Whitmore isn't a social reform platform. Charlotte's eyes sharpened, and I'm questioning whether you've mistaken exclusion for objectivity. Before Nathan could respond, the boardroom doors opened. Richard Halston and several trustees entered, their expressions tense with anticipation. This was no longer just a family introduction. It was a legal and symbolic challenge to succession. Inside the conference room, Nathan laid a leather file on the polished oak table. DNA confirmation. Private trust amendments. Old letters from Edward Whitmore. Every document proved the same thing. Nathan was real. The son hidden from the public record. The black sun raised outside the empire, now standing in front of it. And yet, Charlotte noticed something painful beneath his initial bias. He was not judging her from the comfort of white privilege. He was judging her from the bitterness of a black man who had spent his whole life believing Whitmore excellence required emotional distance, impossible standards, and perfection sharper than compassion. In some ways, he had internalized the same system that wounded them both. The inheritance session dragged into the afternoon, but the real shift came elsewhere. Down in the lower records annex, Mia Brooks was no longer the only one digging. A woman stood in the dim archive corridor surrounded by finance ledgers and scanned municipal contracts. Sophia Bennett was 31, a black investigative journalist with striking almond-shaped eyes, warm bronze skin, and a sleek chin-length bob that framed a face both elegant and relentless. She dressed in understated professionalism. Camel coat, black trousers, leather notebook always in hand, but the real force in her presence came from her stillness. Sophia had built her reputation exposing healthcare corruption after losing her aunt to a hospital closure in a black neighborhood. Since then, she had made a career out of following financial decisions to the lives they quietly destroyed. She looked up as Charlotte entered. You're harder to meet now that everyone knows your face. Charlotte almost smiled. Depends who's looking. Sophia slid several printed budget reports across the table. These came from Whitmore's legacy finance branch, old community service budgets. Charlotte scanned the highlighted lines. Roxbury Urgent Care Satellite, closed. Dorchester Women's Clinic, reduced overnight staff. Mattapan Pediatric Outreach, dissolved. Each decision had been buried beneath phrases like operational streamlining and revenue optimization. But the map was obvious. The cuts had targeted black neighborhoods first. Charlotte's pulse slowed into cold focus. These weren't random. No, Sophia said, they were strategic financial withdrawals from communities your father was trying to expand into. The room chilled. Another thread tied back to Edward Whitmore's vision of equal care. Sophia leaned against the table. The board sold it as efficiency. But once the clinics closed, private pharmaceutical outreach moved into those same neighborhoods. Halcyon. Charlotte didn't need the name spoken aloud. The political marriage, the missing drug trial files, the erased adverse outcomes. Now financial abandonment feeding research exploitation. Every road led toward the same machine. Later that evening, Charlotte returned to the Executive Observatory Lounge where Nathan stood alone overlooking Boston Harbor. The city lights reflected in the glass behind him, doubling his silhouette like a man split between two lives. She placed the finance reports on the side table. You said Whitmore was built on standards, she said quietly. Take a look at what those standards cost. Nathan read in silence. The more pages he turned, the more the controlled mask on his face began to fracture. These clinics were in black districts. Yes, he looked up. And Halcyon expanded trials there right after. Charlotte nodded. For the first time, his skepticism toward her shifted into something else. Not trust. Recognition. The realization that the empire he had long idealized from a distance might have been weaponized against people who looked like both of them. Nathan exhaled slowly. I spent years believing this hospital denied me because I wasn't inside the name. Charlotte met his eyes. Maybe it denied all of us because we were never the kind of black legacy they wanted in public. The words settled between them like a verdict. Not siblings yet, not allies fully, but no longer opponents standing on opposite sides of a false argument. The night deepened over Boston, and somewhere below them, ambulance sirens echoed off the city streets. Whitmore Medical glowed against the skyline like a monument to prestige. But beneath its polished steel and donor-funded glass, Charlotte could now see the hidden architecture more clearly than ever. Her father's dream had not simply been interrupted by tragedy. It had been systematically dismantled, through service cuts, exploitative trials, and boardroom decisions disguised as neutral finance. Nathan closed the final report and looked at Charlotte again, this time without the quiet prejudice he had arrived with that morning. The courtroom duel between them had ended not in victory, but in evidence. And in Whitmore, evidence always changed the balance of power. A dense gray fog rolled over Boston Harbor the next morning, swallowing the skyline in layers of cold, white silence. From the upper floors of Whitmore Medical, the city looked half-erased, as if the world outside were mirroring what Charlotte Whitmore had begun to uncover inside the hospital's walls. The polished institution that had once seemed merely biased now stood before her as something far darker, a machine capable of burying entire communities beneath policy, finance, and prestige. After Nathan's arrival and Sophia Bennett's discovery of targeted service cuts in black neighborhoods, Charlotte had spent the night in the archive tower with Ethan, Mia, and Sophia, following every trail that still led back to her father. The breakthrough came just before dawn. In the restricted legacy planning vault beneath the original Whitmore administrative wing, Sophia unlocked a digitized board archive hidden behind a shell company index. The screen flickered. Then a title appeared. Whitmore Equal Care Initiative, Founding Executive Launch Dossier. For a long moment, no one in the room moved. Charlotte stared at the words, her pulse thudding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her father had not only dreamed of equal care, he had built it. Sophia Bennett, her bronze skin glowing faintly under the blue-white archive light, looked up from the terminal with the still, lethal focus that had made her one of Boston's most feared investigative journalists. At 31, Sophia carried herself with controlled precision, but behind her calm professionalism lived the memory of watching her aunt die after the closure of a women's clinic in Roxbury. That loss had taught her that healthcare racism rarely arrived wearing open hatred. It came in spreadsheets, board votes, and delayed ambulances. She opened the first folder. Projected satellite trauma centers in black and immigrant neighborhoods. Scholarship pathways for black nurses and surgeons. Emergency transport parity rules. Bias audits in triage algorithms. Cross-neighborhood mobile cardiology units. The plan was breathtaking in scale. Not symbolic reform. Structural redesign. Charlotte's father had been preparing to rebuild Boston healthcare equity from the inside out. Mia Brooks let out a stunned breath. At this scale, this would have changed the city. Mia, still wearing the same dark sweater from the overnight archive shift, brushed a loose braid from her cheek and continued scanning metadata trails. Her sharp research instincts had grown more relentless since learning Whitmore trials targeted black communities. For Mia, every file now felt personal, not just because of the ethics violations, but because the same system had once delayed treatment for her mother. Then Sophia opened the final executive memo. Her face changed. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. Sophia slowly turned the monitor toward them. A confidential toxicology consultation. Private physician note, executive wellness report. 3 weeks before the Equal Care Initiative launch, Edward Whitmore had reported unexplained dizziness, tremors, cognitive fog, and progressive cardiovascular instability. Symptoms inconsistent with stress. The next document made the room freeze. Trace arsenic accumulation pattern consistent with prolonged low-dose poisoning. No one spoke. The silence was too large. 20 years of whispered racism, donor politics, and systemic neglect suddenly collapsed into something even more horrifying. This had never been just personal bias. The racism infecting Whitmore had been preserved through murder. Sophia's voice came low and steady. He was being poisoned slowly before the official car accident. Charlotte gripped the edge of the steel archive desk until her knuckles whitened. The room around her blurred. Every memory of her father returning late, looking tired, holding his silver watch tighter than usual, now reshaped itself into warning signs no one had named. Nathan, standing across the room in a dark cashmere overcoat thrown over his suit, stepped closer to the screen. The skepticism he had arrived with in Chapter 5 was gone, replaced by a colder kind of disbelief. For a man who had spent years worshipping Whitmore excellence from outside the gates, the evidence felt like learning the cathedral had been built over bones. "This means someone knew the initiative would threaten existing contracts," Nathan said. Sophia nodded, and someone inside the executive circle had access to his medical care. The fog beyond the basement window wells thickened, pressing white against the glass like history refusing to stay buried. Before anyone could follow the toxicology chain further, Ethan's pager erupted. The sound shattered the room's paralysis. He checked the screen, and his face darkened immediately. A patient in the emergency trauma wing. Uninsured. Gunshot wound. No VIP status, no board priority. Vanessa had ordered diversion. Ethan didn't hesitate. By the time Charlotte and Mia reached the ER floor, the hallway had already become a battlefield of voices, rolling carts, and fluorescent panic. On the gurney lay a young black man, no older than 20, blood soaking through a torn gray hoodie. Marcus Hill, 21, was a college student from Dorchester. Slim and athletic, with short twisted hair and a face still young enough to look almost boyish beneath the pain. His older sister, sobbing near the wall, kept repeating that no other hospital had accepted him fast enough. Marcus had been caught in crossfire outside a subway station. But what truly made his case dangerous inside Whitmore was simpler. He had no insurance and no donor ties. Vanessa Cole stood near the trauma bay doors, arms crossed. Her polished auburn hair and flawless ivory blouse looked almost obscene against the chaos. "I gave clear instructions," she said sharply. "Transfer him to municipal." Ethan, already gloved, didn't even slow down. "He won't survive the transfer." Vanessa's green eyes hardened. "This is not your call." Ethan stopped just long enough to face her. "It became my call the second your policy chose paperwork over a pulse." Then he pushed into Trauma Bay 2. Charlotte followed close behind, every alarm in her chest ringing with the ugly familiarity of the moment. A black patient, no insurance. A white executive woman weaponizing policy. The same architecture of racism her father had tried to dismantle. The surgery lasted 42 brutal minutes. Ethan worked with the absolute steadiness that had made him one of Whitmore's best trauma surgeons. Sweat gathered at his temples, his dark eyes focused with the fierce calm of someone who had already lost too many patients to administrative cruelty. Charlotte assisted where she could, handing instruments, managing pressure calls, and watching the monitors climb back toward life. When Marcus finally stabilized, the room exhaled as one, but the victory lasted less than 5 minutes. 2 hospital compliance officers entered. At their center was Martin Shaw, the hospital's legal enforcement director, a square-faced man in his 50s with thinning silver hair, rimless glasses, and the detached neutrality of someone who had spent his career protecting institutions over people. Once, a malpractice attorney who lost a daughter to a billing-related transfer delay, Martin had buried his grief beneath rules until policy became the only language he trusted. He handed Ethan a formal notice. "Pending executive review, your surgical privileges are suspended for violating transfer compliance and acting against direct strategic instruction." The ER floor fell silent. Nurses froze. Residents stared. Charlotte felt the injustice land like physical force. Vanessa didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her silence carried triumph. Ethan removed his gloves slowly, his face unreadable. Behind him, Marcus's heart monitor continued its steady beep, proof that the patient was alive because Ethan had disobeyed. Sophia stepped into the corridor moments later, still holding the equal care toxicology files. She took in the scene. The suspended black surgeon, the saved uninsured black patient, Vanessa's cold satisfaction, and understood the full shape of the story. 20 years ago, Whitmore poisoned a black ally to stop equal care reform. Today, it punished another for practicing it. The racism here was no longer personal insult. It was institutional self-defense. Charlotte stepped beside Ethan. They're trying to make an example of you. Ethan's expression remained calm, but his voice carried something heavier than anger. Then make sure the example reaches the board. Outside, the fog over Boston had begun to lift, revealing the city in a hard winter light. Inside Whitmore Medical, the truth had finally crossed a line it could no longer retreat from. Her father had been poisoned to stop equity. Ethan had been suspended for saving the life that same equity was supposed to protect. And Charlotte now understood that the final battle would not simply be about inheritance or image. It would be about proving that Whitmore's racism had always been enforced as policy, protected as finance, and, when necessary, defended through slow murder. The chapter ended there, with Ethan's suspension notice in Charlotte's hand and her father's equal care initiative glowing on Sophia's tablet like a promise interrupted for 20 years. Boston woke beneath a clear winter sky. The fog of the previous day burned away by a sharp golden sunrise that turned the glass walls of Whitmore Medical into a tower of fire. From the executive floors, the city looked almost peaceful, rows of brownstones, the harbor shimmering in cold light. Commuters flowing through streets that had no idea the most powerful hospital in Massachusetts was about to place its own soul on trial. Charlotte Whitmore stood alone in the board chamber before the others arrived, wearing a tailored black suit beneath her white executive coat, the silver Whitmore crest gleaming over her heart. Her deep brown skin caught the morning light with quiet strength, and her dark eyes carried the stillness of someone who had finally seen the full anatomy of corruption. In one hand, she held Ethan's suspension notice. In the other, Sophia's tablet containing the equal care files and her father's toxicology report. Today was no longer about whispers, coded racism, or hidden financial cuts. Today was about evidence. By 9 o'clock, the executive chamber was full. Trustees, donors, department heads, legal counsel. Nathan Whitmore stood at Charlotte's right, his tall frame steady in a charcoal suit, the old distance in his hazel eyes replaced by hard clarity. The skepticism that had defined his arrival was gone. In its place stood a man confronting the truth that his exclusion and Charlotte's discrimination had been engineered by the same institution. At the far end of the room sat Vanessa Cole, flawless as ever in a cream blazer, green eyes unreadable. Beside her was Graham Voss, the hospital's chief financial officer, and the first truly new face Charlotte had not yet confronted directly. Graham was 62, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a dark, three-piece suit that projected cultivated respectability. His face was square and calm, his blue eyes almost gentle at first glance, but his reputation had been built on one brutal principle: survival of institutions through ruthless arithmetic. 20 years earlier, after losing his own brother when a private hospital collapsed financially, Graham had devoted his life to making sure numbers always came before ideals. In his world, compassion was only valuable if it could be monetized. Richard Halston opened the meeting with formal stiffness. We are here to review Dr. Ethan Brooks's suspension, the executive integrity claims, and the succession concerns raised by recent events. Charlotte stood before he could continue. "No," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber like a verdict. "We're here to review how this hospital has protected racial inequality, buried medical crimes, and destroyed my father to preserve profit." The room went dead silent. Sophia Bennett rose from the side legal table, bronze skin luminous beneath the boardroom lights, her sleek bob tucked behind one ear as she connected her tablet to the main display. Her face remained composed, but the journalist's fire in her almond-shaped eyes burned brighter than ever. The first file filled the wall screen. Whitmore Equal Care Initiative, Satellite Trauma Units, bias-free triage algorithms, community transport equity, minority scholarship pipelines. Then came the toxicology report. Slow arsenic accumulation. 3 weeks before Edward Whitmore's launch speech. A ripple of disbelief moved through the room. Charlotte turned toward Graham Voss. These budget cuts in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan all routed patients into Halcyon-supported trials. The same neighborhoods were stripped of emergency services months before the outreach contracts expanded. Sophia changed slides, finance authorizations, shell transfers, private trial subsidies. Every signature chain led to Graham. Vanessa's posture stiffened. Nathan stepped forward next, placing the old trust amendments beside the financial ledgers. "He used my inheritance claim as leverage," Nathan said, voice low and precise. "He fed me incomplete files and convinced me Charlotte's leadership would destroy Whitmore's standards. He weaponized my resentment." The board's attention snapped to Graham. For the first time, the CFO's composure cracked. "This hospital survived because I made hard decisions," he said. "Your father's equal care initiative would have bled donor confidence dry." Charlotte's voice sharpened. "So you poisoned him!" Gasps broke across the room. Graham didn't deny it. He simply exhaled. "I stabilized the future." There it was, the naked truth of systemic racism, not hate in its loudest form, but calculated violence in service of preserving power, money, and a white donor structure that never wanted black neighborhoods treated as equal lives. Vanessa finally spoke, but the steel in her voice had weakened. "I didn't know about the poisoning." Sophia changed the slide again. Encrypted emails, Vanessa's archived communications, transfer policy overrides, insurance suppression memos, the same protocol used to push Marcus Hill out of Whitmore before Ethan intervened. "You may not have poisoned Edward Whitmore," Charlotte said, "but you continued the same machine." Vanessa's silence was answer enough. Before Richard could call for recess, the chamber doors burst open. A trauma nurse rushed in. Nurse Elena Ruiz, still in Navy scrubs from the overnight shift, her dark hair slightly loose and exhaustion written across her compassionate face, looked directly at Charlotte. "There's a pediatric aortic rupture in OR 6. The attending surgeon collapsed in prep. No one else on site can do the repair in time." Every eye in the room shifted. Only one surgeon in the building had the survival rate for that procedure. Ethan. Richard frowned. "He's suspended." Charlotte looked at the trauma feed on Elena's tablet. A little black girl, maybe 8 years old, bleeding internally after a highway collision. Her family from Roxbury, no premium insurance, no donor status. The room itself seemed to become the final moral test. Charlotte lifted Ethan's suspension notice, then tore it cleanly in half. "Dr. Brooks is reinstated effective now." Vanessa rose. "You can't do that unilaterally." Charlotte met her stare. "I just did." Minutes later, Oregon 6 became the true courtroom of the chapter. Bright surgical lights replaced chandeliers. Monitors replaced board microphones. Evidence was now pulse, blood pressure, and seconds. Ethan entered the operating room in dark blue scrubs, his broad frame calm despite the weight of what this moment meant. The little girl on the table, Ava Thompson, 8 years old, small and fragile with deep brown skin and tightly braided hair still tied with pink ribbons from school that morning, had been riding home with her mother when a truck lost control on the freeway. Her mother survived with minor injuries. Ava's rupture would kill her within minutes without the exact repair Ethan specialized in. Charlotte stood in the observation gallery beside Sophia, Nathan, and half the board. This was no longer symbolic. The institution that had suspended a black surgeon for saving an uninsured black patient now had to watch him save another life in real time. Ethan's hands moved with breathtaking control. Clamp, pressure, microsuture, repair. The monitors dipped, rose, then steadied. Ava's heartbeat normalized. The operating room exhaled in relief. Behind the glass, several trustees who had supported Vanessa's policies lowered their eyes. The lesson was no longer theoretical. The man they punished for choosing life had just become the reason a child from the same neglected neighborhoods survived. Back in the board chamber an hour later, the outcome was swift. Graham Voss was placed under criminal investigation for homicide conspiracy, financial fraud, and medical discrimination. Vanessa was terminated and referred for regulatory review. Richard Halston resigned before the vote could force him out. Then Eleanor Whitmore rose slowly with the aid of her cane. The 76-year-old matriarch's mahogany skin seemed almost bronze in the afternoon sun pouring through the windows. I hid Nathan's existence to protect both branches of this family from the board's racial optics and inheritance manipulation, she said quietly. I was wrong to believe silence could protect what truth needed to heal. Nathan lowered his head once. Not in anger, in understanding. Finally, the vote. Charlotte Whitmore was unanimously confirmed as CEO of Whitmore Medical. Her first signed order came immediately. Whitmore Equal Care Initiative, Executive Reactivation. Sophia smiled for the first time in hours. Nathan accepted leadership of the New York Research Branch, now fully transparent. Mia Brooks was appointed Director of Clinical Ethics and Safe Trial Oversight. And Ethan, still in surgical scrubs, was named Chief of Trauma Surgery. As sunset turned Boston Harbor gold, Charlotte stood in the glass corridor outside the board chamber beside Ethan. The city below moved as always, unaware that one institution had finally been forced to confess its sins. They tried to make examples of us, Ethan said quietly. Charlotte looked at the glowing skyline. Now we become the example. And with that, Whitmore Medical's final chapter closed not with silence, but with truth, justice, and a future where no black child, no uninsured family, and no brilliant black woman would ever again be told they did not belong. The deepest lesson from this story is that injustice rarely survives in the light of truth. What happened inside Whitmore Medical reminds us that discrimination does not always come through loud words or obvious cruelty. Sometimes it hides inside policies, systems, habits, and quiet decisions that slowly harm the people a society already overlooks. In everyday life, this teaches us to pay attention not only to how people speak, but to how they treat those with less power, less money, or less status. True character is revealed in the moments when no one important seems to be watching. Charlotte and Ethan also remind us that courage is often choosing what is right, even when it costs reputation, comfort, or safety. Many of us may never stand in a hospital boardroom, but we all face moments where fairness, kindness, and integrity are tested at work, in school, in our families, and in our communities. Speaking up for someone being ignored, refusing to join prejudice, and helping those who cannot repay us are small acts that can change the future more than we realize. There's also a powerful educational lesson here about systems. We should teach ourselves and the next generation to question unfair rules, harmful traditions, and structures that seem normal simply because they have existed for a long time. Progress happens when brave people combine compassion with evidence, wisdom with action, and truth with persistence. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who still believes kindness and justice can change the world. Leave a comment and tell us what moment touched you the most. If you believe no one should ever be judged by their race, status, or background before they are known, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories that change lives. May God bless every person watching today with wisdom, protection, healing, and the courage to stand for what is right even when the world stays silent. And if you believe truth and compassion will always be stronger than prejudice, comment Amen below.